Buenas tardes, bienvenidos a todos. Me da gusto presentarles el doctor Cris Beauchemin, que nos va a presentar una conferencia sobre el tema de la migración africana en Europa, Vivir entre aquí y allá. El doctor Cris Beauchemin es investigador en el Instituto Nacional de Estudios Demográficos de Francia, en París, el INED, conocido como el INED, y es también profesor invitado del Departamento de Demografía de la Universidad de Montreal. Y bueno, es un especialista sobre justamente la migración, las conexiones entre los lugares de origen y de destino, y especialmente el contexto africano, ¿no? Sus obras se relacionan con las tendencias de la migración, las inversiones de los migrantes, la migración de retorno, las familias transnacionales, la integración y el transnacionalismo. O sea, muchos temas que aquí conocemos, pero que generalmente trabajamos o escuchamos para las perspectivas de la migración de México o de América Latina hacia Estados Unidos. Y ahí nos va a dar toda la perspectiva desde otros continentes, como son las relaciones entre África y Europa. Cris Beauchemin es doctor de la Universidad de París 8 en Francia y tiene una formación inicial en geografía. Ha sido responsable de varios proyectos con encuestas importantes, el proyecto de la migración entre África y Europa, que está conocido como la encuesta MAFE, y la encuesta de trayectorias de origen. Y actualmente está a cargo del proyecto Migración, Integración y Transnacionalismo, que se centra en los movimientos circulares, las familias que viven en Europa y sus países de origen, y las relaciones económicas de los migrantes con su país de origen. Sus publicaciones son muy numerosas, no les voy a citar todo, solo comentar que muy recientemente ha coordinado un número especial de la International Migration Review sobre aproximaciones multifocales a la migración internacional. Entonces, ha coordinado el número, en lo cual también ha participado con varios artículos. Entonces, es un investigador muy productivo que estamos recibiendo hoy. Nos da mucho gusto de escuchar lo que nos va a comentar, y la conferencia la va a impartir en inglés, y después las preguntas las pueden hacer en inglés o en español y retraduciendo para los que prefieran preguntar directamente en español. Bueno, Cris, bienvenida y adelante.
Thank you very much, Marilla. Thank you very much for this invitation, and sorry because I'm not able to speak in Spanish, so my talk will be in English. I hope you'll be able to understand. And if you have questions during the presentation, you can interrupt me and ask, and I'll try to answer as far as I can. So the title of my presentation today is African Migration in Europe, Living Between Here and There. And what I'm going to present is largely the result of the MAFE project that Marie-Laure just presented, which is a project. The full title is Migration Between Africa and Europe. And actually, what was very important for us in this project and in my presentation today was to try to go beyond a unidirectional view of migration. What I want to say when I say unidirectional view of migration is that when you look at the literature, the social demographic literature on international migration, it's heavily biased toward destination countries. We have a lot of information on immigration destination countries. We have very few information on return. We have very few quantitative information on families living apart across borders, with, let's say, fathers or mothers being in the destination countries and children left behind, or partners who are living in different countries. And what we wanted to do with this project was to gather quantitative information on these aspects of migration, to go beyond this unidirectional view of migration. And in this presentation today, I'm going to present results mainly on family issues, and to show you to what extent African migrants in Europe live actually in transnational families with partners or with children that they left behind. and I'll try to explain a bit how it works and why African migrants are so numerous to live apart together across borders. So the outline of my presentation is, as you can see on this slide. I will present very briefly. African migration. I thought that it was not very familiar things to you. Then I will present the MAFE data, the data that we produce in the MAFE project, and then some results on family arrangements of African migrants in Europe. This will be mainly descriptive, and then I present you more results on couple reunification and what are the factors of couple reunification, and also the factors that make that people continue to live separately. So some elements of context. Clearly, African migration in Europe is a major policy concern. There is this idea that there would be a kind of invasion from Africa into Europe. This is especially true since 2005, because there were, since 2005, various events that were heavily mediatized, and the last one you heard about it probably last week, and this is a picture that I took from the New York Times. This is not what happened last week, but since 2005, there have been numerous events that were spread in media and that gave the impression that there is an invasion of African migrants in Europe, which is clearly not the case. I will come back on this, but still this is the view that most people have in Europe and also in the rest of the world, as you can see on this picture of the New York Times. The other thing about African migration that shows that that's a major policy concern is the fact that African migration is very frequently stigmatized in the public debate, including by people who are ministers. It's not only common people in the streets. In the media, African migrants are very stigmatized, and this is again an excerpt from the New York Times. It was about riots that happened in France in 2005 also. And some ministers, several of them, declared that if there were riots in suburbs in France, it was because of polygamous African families, and it was just, again, African families being held responsible for social problems that are that are far beyond their own being. So, in fact, as I mentioned before, if you look seriously at statistical information on stocks and flows of migrants in Europe, there are a minority. And here this comes from Eurostat, which is the central statistical agency in Europe. And this is the stock of immigrants in Europe. And you can see that sub-Saharan African migrants are only 12% of all immigrants in Europe. So they are clearly a minority, and they are much less numerous than what the public debate and especially media let us believe. Also, another important fact is that for the most, African migrants are well-educated people, and it runs counter the idea that there are very poor people with no education and so on. And this comes from a national representative survey in France, which is a country where African migrants are especially numerous. And you can see at the bottom of the graph the percentage of people in France, in total population, who have a diploma from tertiary education. You can see that the average for all migrants is 28, and you can see that sub-Saharan migrants are much more numerous to have a degree of tertiary education. So they are a minority, they are well educated. And also I mentioned before that African families are stigmatized, and there is this idea that when one migrant arrives, then he's going to call his or her whole family, and that family reunification is a problem among sub-Saharan migrants. And here, from the same survey, I compare all migrants with sub-Saharan migrants, and you can see the percentage of reunified migrants. And I distinguish between males and females, and you can see that actually family reunification among African migrants, among sub-Saharan migrants, is less frequent than among all migrants. So clearly it's not, again, it runs counter this common view that all African migrants would and are actually reunifying in France and more generally in Europe. And as I will show in the rest of my presentation, actually they do not reunify because a large proportion of African migrants, sub-Saharan migrants, live apart together across borders, which meant that they live in different countries. So people, couples who are separated, who are together but living in different countries, and or parents who do not live with their children. Okay, I will come back on this to give you some figures about these families living apart together across borders. But before that, I want to explain what was the MAFE project, because this is the data that I use in the rest of the presentation. So basically, the MAFE project was inspired by the MMP that you probably know, the Mexican Migration Project, which is a multi-site survey. So the important idea we took from the MMP was to do a survey with interviews in African countries at origin and in destination countries. The difference is that we have several origin in Africa and that we did the survey in several destination countries. So we did the survey among Congolese people who were interviewed in Congo and in Europe. They were interviewed in Belgium and in the UK. We did the survey with Ghanaians people who were interviewed in Ghana at origin and in destination country. The destination countries were the Netherlands and the UK again, and also among Senegalese people in Senegal, of course, and in Europe, in France, Italy, and Spain. And for all these origins I just mentioned, the idea was in Europe to have both the traditional historical destination country, which is usually the former colonial country. So, for instance, France for Senegalese people, Belgium for Congolese, UK for Ghanaians. So, in Africa, we sampled households and individuals, and in Africa, these individuals are non-migrants, people who never migrated abroad, and also returnees. And we did the survey only in capital cities, in the regions of the capital cities, and in the region of Kumasi in Ghana. There were straightforward random samples, and you can see the numbers, the number of interviewees. So the number are quite small, but most of the information we collected is life histories, which means that actually our units of observations are the years lived by the people rather than just the individual. I will come back on this. In Europe, sampling was much more complicated. We have in Europe migrants, obviously. This was our target. And as you can see, I wrote samples are representative as far as possible at the national level. Why as far as possible? Because actually there is no sampling frame that allows to survey all sorts of migrants, because we wanted to include undocumented migrants, of course, but no sampling frame, except in Spain, where they have an incredible municipal register, which is called the Padrón, maybe you know it, where undocumented migrants register. So in Spain we had a real representative sample, and in the other countries we used a quota method, and we used a combination of selection methods to try to identify the migrants we wanted to survey. And you have again the numbers. Basically, we had around 200 migrants per origin and destination countries, which in the end make the numbers you can see here. Oops. Okay, so we did the survey in the surveys in 2008, 2009. We collected, so I mentioned multi-level database on the presentation, because we have household data that we collected in Africa. We have individual data, which are mainly life histories in all countries, both in Africa and in Europe. And we have also some contextual databases, including on policies, so to get information at the country level. And the most important feature is that the most important part of the data are retrospective data, life histories, a bit like in the MMP, which also collected life histories, but we did it in a different way for many reasons. If you compare the MMP and the MAFE questionnaires, for instance, you'll see that in the MMP it's very, it let a large degree of freedoms to the interviewers, while our questions were had very precise questions to ask to the interviewers. And also, a lot of differences come from the fact that we are in a very different context. In between Mexico and the US, there is one border. When you want to describe the routes followed by migrants coming from Africa to go to Europe, there are numerous countries that they can cross, and they have also a lot of possible destinations. So we needed to collect a lot of information, much more information than when you register information on Mexican migrants going to the US. What is important is that we use exactly the same questionnaires in all countries, and the databases are thus completely comparable, except minor exceptions on variables, on very cultural variables such as ethnic groups or religions, those variables that are clearly not the same in all countries. And the data are available, so if you want to exercise a bit with life histories, do not hesitate to use it. Okay, so I'm coming back to some results that we produced with the MAFE data, and just to give you, for a start, some view on the fact on how frequent it is for African migrants to live apart together across borders, to live in transnational arrangements. So here it's the information at the time of the survey. About 25% of our migrants in Europe had no nuclear family, which means that they had no partner, no children. And the graph you can see here is about those who had a nuclear family, so either children or a partner. And you can see three categories: those people who were in a transnational family, which means that they had at least one partner or one child in the origin countries. The reunified people, those who moved first and then were joined by their family, and those who are told to be unified, which are those who moved at the same time with their partner or children. And you can see that there are significant numbers of transnational families with some variations, but you can see that, for instance, among Senegalese migrants, the amount is 60%. It's huge. It's less among Ghanaians and Congolese migrants, but still there are never less than 20% of migrants who live separately from their family. Here, it's another view on this idea of living apart together across borders, and this is Kaplan-Meier curves, which I'm going to explain a bit. Basically, here you have the time. It's the number of years. And here you have the proportion of LATAB couples. LATAB means living apart together across borders. So, and at time zero, we look at the couples who are separated in the sense that one is in Europe, one of the partners is in Europe, the other one is in Africa, right? Yes? Oh, I thought you had a question. Okay, so at time zero, all of them are separated. And you follow them over time, and after 10 years, you have the proportion of those who are still living apart together across borders. And you can see that the numbers are huge. You can see that for Senegalese people, 10 years after separation due to migration, because one of the partners migrated, 10 years after this separation, 80% of the Senegalese couples are still separated, with one being in Europe, the other one still being in Africa. The proportion is less for Ghanaians, 75%, and for Congolese, 63%. So what it shows, again, is that living apart together across borders is very common and is also very long-lasting. I mean, when it starts, when people are separated at the beginning, they remain separated for a very long time, and for a huge majority of them. And also you can see some differences, as I mentioned, between Senegal, Ghana, and Congo. And what it reflects, actually, is both the fact that Congo, it's Congo-Kinshasa, the Republic Democratic of Congo, is a country where there was civil war in the 90s, and clearly there are less numbers to live apart together across borders because partners were more prompt to reunify because of this war context at origin. Another part of the story to explain differences between the different groups is about gender relationships, and I'll come back on this. But there is in the qualitative literature evidence that in countries in the African context, in countries where the relationship between males and females are more egalitarian, there is a stronger propensity to live together, while when relationships are more unequal, then there is a larger propensity to live apart together. Here it's about children, so reunification with children, and it's again the same kind of graph where you can see the number of years since separation due to migration here, and here the proportion of migrants who are separated from at least one child. And again, you can see that after 10 years, separation is still quite important. This graph is about Ghana. You can see that 1 out of 4 of the left behind children are still separated from their migrant parent after 10 years, which is a huge 10 years for a child. You can see that half of them were joined in Ghana by their returning parents. So what it means is that reunification occurs not only in Europe, in destination countries, but quite often in origin countries, which is something completely overlooked by policies in Europe, because they just see reunification in Europe, but do not consider the fact that some migrants return and that they can reunify in the origin country. This is part of this unilateral view of migration that I mentioned in my introduction. And finally, only a quarter of the children were reunified in Europe. And here you have the graph for Senegal and Congo, and you can see that basically this is the same story, and that reunification in Europe is not the more likely outcome of a separation period. So this view that all African migrants reunify in Europe, it's completely false. Here, it's again the same kind of graph, with here the numbers of years of separation, and here the proportion of children separated from their parents. And it's unreadable, I guess, for you where you are, but it's both on France. It compares France and Spain. And what you show here is that the bold lines are for Senegalese people, and you can see that compared to other groups, here you have Latinos in Spain. You can see that Senegalese migrants have a much larger propensity to live to stay separated from their parents, from their children. But still, if you look at other groups, except those ones who are Southeast Asia and European migrants, you can see that after 10 years, most of the groups have still a large share of migrants who are separated from their children. Okay, so what's the rationale for living apart together, for living in these transnational lives? So there is, if you look at the literature, there are some economic reasons to live apart. The idea that if you're by yourself in Europe, then you're going to make more money, to spend less money, and then the idea is that transnational families would be better for earning maximization, because reunification actually is costly. If you want to have your wife or husband and children with you in Europe, it's very costly. So that would be part of the explanation. The idea also is that families decide to live apart together across borders for risk sharing and mutual insurance, and this is something that you may be familiar with, because this is something that is also often mentioned about Mexican migrants. So the idea that living in different places, then you're able to to better deal with the risks that somebody has in one place or somebody else in the other place. And also, the idea is that being by yourself in Europe will help migrants to reach their target quicker with the idea to return in their origin country and to reunify in their origin country. There is, to explain this tendency to live apart together across borders, there are also social norms. And the fact that in the sub-Saharan context, obviously the sub-Saharan Africa is a huge continent, and there are many differences within sub-Saharan Africa, but still there are some common traits in the various countries. And there is this idea, extended families are quite common, and also there is this idea from Lututala, who is a Congolese demographer, who talked about ubiquitous families. And it's this idea that families, even within their country, are used to live separately in different places. Partners are used to live in different places, and children are very commonly fostered to other households with grandparents or an aunt or an uncle. And this is very common within the countries to have this kind of separate way of life. Yes, this is it. So, but what I wanted to, I just mentioned that Africa is a huge continent, and actually there are big differences between countries, and I mentioned here, Senegal, highly patriarchal, because if you look at available statistics on Senegal, you will see that this idea of living separately is much more common. Living apart together couples are much more common in this country. Foster children are also much more common. And actually it has to do with the functioning of the African family, in which, in these extended families, the elders have a very strong influence on couples' life and on family life, and they have a strong decision power. And finally, when people marry, it's not forced marriage, but it's arranged by the elders, so that there is some distance between the couples, and this patriarchal system with the elders deciding for their children creates some distance within the couples. Hence this idea of by Finlay of couples of low consistency. And in Senegal in particular, where polygamy is quite common, it creates additional distance within the couples. And also, final possible explanation is to explain why people live separately is the policy hypothesis, the fact that in Europe, most countries adopted, especially since the 90s, more and more restrictive measures to limit reunification. And the question at stake finally is to what extent the fact that people live separately is the result of a self-selection. There is this cultural, let's say, habit to live separately. But to what extent is this due to this self-selection, this willingness to live separately, versus state selection, which is the fact that destination countries can create barriers to reunification, and it's complicated to disentangle these two aspects. So disentangling this self versus state selection is what we try to do in a paper on couples, and I'm going to explain how we did it. So as I mentioned before, what we collected is life histories. So here it's an example. It shows how we collected the data, and it shows how the data are in our files. So here it's the life of somebody. Yes, he's a migrant. He was born in 73. This year he was 0. And then you have one line per year. And so each year he grows older, obviously. And you you know here that this year, 2003, he married Fatima. It was his first union. And you can see where he was living each year. So here you can see that he went to France. This year he went to Spain, etc. And here you have the country where his partner was living. And you can see that until 2006, Fatima was in Senegal, and then she moved to Spain. Okay. And you can see also the socio-economic status, and there are a lot of variables that describe the migrant and also his or her partner. And here you can see what we labeled as a LATAB period, living apart together across borders, because you can see that they are not in the same country. He's in Spain. He's in Spain. She's in Senegal. And this year they reunify because, again, they're living together in Spain. So what we look at is the timing of reunification, how long it takes for couples who are living apart together across borders to reunify, and actually you already saw some results before. And what we wanted to do was to study the factors that explain that they reunify. So what we did was to run logit discrete time models, which mean basically these are logit models, but instead of being applied to one individual, our unit of analysis is the year that was lived by the interviewees. And the dependent variable was reunification in Europe, so living again together in Europe, in one of the MAFE countries, which are the countries I mentioned before. And we look at overall reunification, which means that we do not look at reunification as a legal thing. It's not the administrative status. It's not people are reunified because they have a title saying that they were reunified. It's just we see that they are reunified. And it might be thanks to a legal status, but it might be also de facto reunification, because, for instance, the partner can come for studies, not for reunification officially, but also because the partner can come unofficially as an undocumented migrant, and we also take into account this. And to try to explain why reunification occurs, we took into account this list of independent variables to take into account state selection. Only state selection. What we have is the country where reunification occurs and the period, which is a proxy for restrictiveness, because we know whether countries were more or less restrictive regarding reunification. We have one variable which is only related to self-selection, which is women's education, because destination countries in Europe have the power to select those people they accept for reunification, but no country in Europe takes into account the level of education of the women. So they take into account, for instance, the socio-economic status of the migrants in Europe. They take into account the fact that people are married or not. They take into account various variables, but they do not take into account I said the woman education, but actually this is because in our... Okay, I'm going too fast. No country looks at the education of the left behind, and here I say women's education because in our analysis, those in Europe are the males and those left behind are the females. And there are some variables, so I mentioned state selection, self-selection, and there are some variables that refers both to self and state selection. Typically, I mentioned polygamy, which is forbidden in European countries. So if a migrant comes and asks for reunification with her second wife, it will just be impossible. But the fact is also that a migrant who is polygamous is not very likely to ask for reunification because it's so stigmatized and it's so costly to have two wives at the same time in Europe that, there is also self-selection in there. And same thing for the socio-economic status. Socio-economic status, in the criteria for reunification, very commonly, there are questions about housing, the quality of housing, or earnings, which refer to socio-economic status. But again, if you look at socio-economic status, migrants who are very poor are not likely to reunify. So if you look at socio-economic status, it's not only if men with a low socio-economic status have a low likelihood of reunification. It's not just because states say it's not possible. It's also because they don't want to do it. So this list of variables here, it really refers to both self and state selection. And we have some control variables that I mentioned here. So time to reunification, which is the first way to enter in this discussion whether there is a state selection effect. And here it's the same thing as the one you saw before, but we distinguish for each origin, we distinguish between the destinations. So here for Ghanaian couples, you can see one curve for UK, one curve for the Netherlands. For Congo, again, you can distinguish 2 destinations and 3 destinations for the Senegalese migrants. And the blue lines represent the countries that are more restrictive, according to an index that was computed by other people than us, but which is a well-known index in Europe on integration and migration policies. So what you can see here, actually, what we would expect would be that countries who are more restrictive, that in countries with more restrictions, we should have less reunification. But what you can see here, especially in the case of Congo and Senegal, is that against policy expectations, that there is more reunification in more restrictive countries. So this is the case here for Congolese people. United Kingdom is more restrictive, but you can see that after 10 years, there are much less couples who are still separated, which means that they are more reunified. And for Senegalese people, couples, same thing. France, which is much more restricted than France, has more reunified couples after 10 years, even though the level is quite high. What does it mean? It means that there are other factors than policies to explain that people reunify or not, that policies is not sufficient. But there are explanations also related to the specific histories of these flows. For instance, for Senegalese people, it has to do with labor migration. Because until the 70s in Europe, in France, France was the main destination of Senegalese migrants in Europe. And when I say the main, it was almost the unique destination. But then France decided to stop labor migration, and at the same time started to allow for reunification. So Senegalese migrants who before the mid-70s, Senegalese migrants were really, I think it's quite similar to return migration in Mexico when it was easy to circulate. Senegalese migrants in France, they didn't want to reunify at that time. They came for work a few years, went back in Senegal, sometimes came back in Europe, or were replaced by a brother, and there was this kind of circular migration. But then it was not possible to enter France for labor migration, and so they settled in France and started to reunify. Whereas in Italy and Spain, who are much nearer destination, Senegalese migrants are still, and who are more open countries to migration, Senegalese migrants tend to have this circular way of migration. So it has a lot to do with openness to labor migration, actually, and to the fact that states allow or not for circulation, with reunification occurring where circulation is not possible. For Congolese migration, it's another story, because actually Congolese migrants in the UK Most of them are refugees. I mentioned the war in Congo before, and actually refugees are much more prone to reunify and can obtain reunification more easily. So here you have some results about from our models. We had one model for each origin, so one model for Congolese couples, Ghanaian couples, Senegalese couples. So remember, we follow the couples once they are separated because of migration. We follow them and until they reunify, if they reunify, and then we look at each moment in time what are their characteristics. And yes, maybe first thing to mention, but I don't show the results here, but the multivariate analysis show that there is no significant result regarding the odds of reunification related to the restrictions, in the policy restrictions. So if you look at the characteristics of the couple, you can see, as expected, that couples who are married are more likely to reunify, because it's just not possible to reunify if you're not married. If you're a polygamous couple, you have much less chances to reunify, which is again very expected, both because of self and state selection, as I mentioned before. But you can see this is not the same story in Congo. And actually it has to do, I think, with the context at origin, the war, the civil war. And you can see here a specific result, which refers to union started at a distance. It means that the couple started while the migrant was already abroad. And the way we interpret this result is that to us it looks like a migration strategy in times of crisis. This is the war, people want to leave, and so they find any way they can. And starting a couple with a migrant is a way to be able to move. Some results about migration conditions. Here, again, as expected, you can see that those who are documented are much more likely to reunify, and this is especially true for Senegalese couples, and this is very expected because obviously being legal eases migration for the partners. And here you can see a result about Senegalese couples, which is very significant, which is visited partner. It means that they the migrant in Europe went back for short-term periods, and so to visit the family. And it's very significant for Senegalese couples, and it actually reflects the way of living of couples in this country, where, as I mentioned before, there is a low level of low consistency within couples because they do not choose each other, because of polygamy, because of the way family function in Senegal. So here you can see this tendency, very specific tendency of Senegalese couples to live apart, together across borders, and to circulate, to maintain the family life. Here you have the information on the socio-economic status of the male migrants in Europe, and as expected, against those who have the higher socioeconomic status are more likely to reunify, and it refers, again, as I mentioned before, it's both state selection and self-selection, because if you're very poor, you're not going to reunify. And you have these results, I think very interesting, about the female's level of education, and you can see that for Ghanaian couples and Senegalese couples, more educated women are much more likely to reunify. Which means, actually, why? It might be because the more educated women in the origin countries, and especially in the more patriarchal context of Senegal, the more educated women are more discriminated or feel more discrimination on the labor market at origin, and so they are the more likely to want to move. They are also those, especially in Senegal, who have probably the higher bargaining power in the family to negotiate the departure, and finally, they are also the most likely to integrate easily in the labor market in destination countries. And you can see that for Congo, again, it's a different story. You do not have these differences according to the level of education. And again, it's probably due to the context at origin. in context of war, there is no selection according to education or socio-economic status. Every people who can move. And I think this is what it tells us here. So what's important here certainly is these results about the female's level of education, which shows that there is self-selection into reunification on a criteria which is not examined by countries at destination. We see a clear self-selection effect, which refers to gender relationships. So if we sum up the results about these analysis on couples, clearly living apart together across border is a very common and long-lasting situation, arrangement. It largely depends on the social context at origin, with reunification more frequent in more gender egalitarian societies. And as we just seen, women education is more influential in patriarchal contexts, which is the sign of self-selection. And I wonder to what extent this question of gender relationship matters in all contexts, including in other settings than African. Maybe you have some ideas about the Mexican case or Latin American migration in general on this. And about the influence of the states at destination, against policy expectations, clearly reunification is not less frequent where policies are more restrictive. And we saw that individuals who comply with the official selection criteria are more likely to reunify, but it might be self-selection, so it's not clear that it's the fact of state selection. So to conclude the whole presentation, some implications maybe. I think there is first thing important is to try to make a conceptual shift and not rather than talking about migration and especially family migration from Africa to Europe. I think it's very important to talk about family migration between Africa and Europe, which is not exactly the same thing. In a case, you look only at immigration in Europe. In the other case, you recognize that some people do reunify at origin, or that some families live apart across together, live together apart across borders, and do not wish to live together in Europe. However, changing this view on migration is a statistical challenge, because generating data with a double view of migration and family is quite complex. It takes surveys in different countries, and well, it's clearly complicated to manage. In any case, there is, I think, a real necessity to overcome what I think is a double Western-centric bias. A first bias is methodological, the fact that most quantitative information we have, especially on reunification, is from the destination country. If you look at reunification statistics in Europe, what you have is the number of titles that the states give for reunification, and so it gives the impression that there is only reunification because we do not give titles for labor migration. So obviously family migration is important, but it's a policy construct. But and this is a problem for studies on family on reunification, because it brings the impression that there is only reunification in Europe. Because of how we built statistics in Europe. The other I think conceptual bias is that policymakers or public opinion in general have a very traditional Western view of family, with the fact that, okay, in a couple you have to live together and you have to live with your children, which is not the case in all contexts. I mean, there are contexts where family does not function like this, and if you just think in a Western way, then you think, okay, they are going to reunify for sure, which is not the case, because it's not how it happens. Okay, some perspectives now. Well, I show you some results I think that show evidence that there is self-selection, but clearly disentangled state and self-selection is complicated, and what we did is still very rough, and I think this is something which needs more research. Try to better disentangle how policy factor interact with individual and family decisions. Another question is about the functioning of transnational families. And I mentioned that most couples after 10 years are still separated. But what does it mean to be a couple after 10 years of living in two different countries? To what extent they are really couples? What kind of interactions do they have? This is something we did not explore here, but that could be explored further. Also, I did not mention here, but this came up in other research. There are other forms of transnational arrangements, and this is a new discovery, at least for me. In France, we realized that it's very common that second-generation children are sent back in the origin country. And so their parents are migrants in France, immigrants. They have children in France, right? But they send them in their origin country, living with the parents staying in Europe. And for sub-Saharan boys, it's 20% of the boys who are sent back in Africa before reaching the age of 18. So it's 1 out of 5. It's huge, and it raises questions about what and it's among, I say 1 out of 5, but it's among people who were surveyed in Europe. So they were sent in Africa and then came back in France, right? But what does it make in their life? What about their education? Is there a disruption effect or not? How do they integrate the labor market after these stays in the origin country? It's not clear at all. And for instance, because those who stay in France, for instance, might be exposed to discrimination, may live in countries, in neighborhoods with a lot of risks of delinquents, etc. So being sent back in the country of origin may be a way to protect them against this environment. And finally, they may have a better education there than in France. But we don't know how people deal with these comings and goings of children. And coming back about the fact that a lot of children are left behind and reunify lately, some of them reunify lately with the parents, I think we also need some more studies on the effect of this late reunification. What happens to children who do not live with their parents for years, and then they are reunified and they come in a completely different context. They have not lived with their parents for years. What happens in terms of school success, in terms of academic integration, and so on. So I think that there are a lot of other things to work on when we think about transnational families. Okay, I just mentioned here the websites on which you can find information on the MAFE project, on which I told a lot, and also on the TEO survey, which is the survey from which I took some results about France. And here is a list of some publications that you can consult if you wish, and from which I took the results I presented today. Thank you.
Muchas gracias por esta presentación muy interesante para nosotros, muy novedosa, con resultados por ser diferente, y otra también encontramos puntos de comparación con la situación que conocemos acá, y también sobre la discusión sobre los puntos de la parte conceptual, cómo identificar las familias que van de un lugar a otro o entre lugares, y también sobre la selección del Estado, selección de las personas, ¿no? Son varios puntos que nos permiten seguir discutiendo. Entonces voy a abrir la sesión de preguntas, comentarios, preguntas, como quieran, en inglés o en español, como prefieran preguntar. Adelante.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay, yes, in English. So, First of all, thank you for your presentation. I would like to ask you about full life history you mentioned during the presentation, if you can tell us something about them, and how you triangulated the results, the quantitative data and the qualitative data. Thank you.
Okay. About the life histories, actually in my institution at INED, there is a long tradition of what we call biographic studies. And so we mixed the MMP approach and the INED approach of life histories, and we have two separate tools in the questionnaire. We have what we call an age event grid. Age event means age event, actually, which is basically what you show the grid I showed, where you follow people from birth until the time of the survey. And so this is used to identify the dates of change, when people married, when they had children, when they migrated, and so on. And you can see, I can't show you, but the important thing is that the respondent and the interviewer see the parallel. You can see the moving fast. They see the parallel between the various topics of life. A lot of movement. It's coming.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. The important thing is, we collected the information on the early days, and the problem with life. Okay. The problem with life histories is that people may have difficulties to remember the dates. But the problem is not really to collect exact dates. The problem is to be sure that the events are properly ordered, and this is something which is not in the MMP questionnaire. I don't know whether you had some time at the MMP questionnaire, but it does not put in parallel the different aspects of life. But in the age event grid, you have the information on family, and usually people do remember when they're married and when they had children, and so these you start with these dates, who are like anchors in the questionnaire, and then progressively you had new information. So here I mentioned only the countries, but actually we asked for the exact location of the people, and so they place in time the different places where they lived, and then if they were married, we have information on the international migration of their partners, and usually, again, giving information on the international migration of somebody else might be complicated, but when this is your partner, I mean, you are likely to remember it. And since it in front of the information you have on the date when you started the partnership, and here you cannot see the children, but children are here also. So people connect all aspects of their life, and they are able to, maybe not exactly the exact year, but they are able to recollect the overall information because it's in parallel. So this is the algebra grid. This is how it functions. And then when we have this information with the dates on the big changes, big events, big periods, then we enter into detailed questions to describe each partnership, each stay abroad, etc., etc. Now about articulation between qualitative and quantitative studies. Matthew was mainly a quantitative survey. There was some qualitative field work by PhD students for their dissertation, but clearly we were very much inspired at the beginning by the anthropological literature. For instance, on transnational families, there is quite a large amount of research on transnational families in Africa. And so what we wanted to do was to put some numbers on these things. And our naive expectation was that having numbers to show that reunification in Europe is not a big deal, we thought that having numbers would be more persuasive with policymakers. This is not the case, actually, because they are still very reluctant to believe what we say. But still, the idea was to try to put some numbers on things that are pretty well observed by social anthropologists.
¿Otras preguntas? Sí.
You mentioned one of the reasons families stay LATAV was risk. Could you explain a little bit more about that?
Risk sharing. Actually, the idea it refers to a school of economics, the new economics of labor migration, and the main author is Odette Stark. The idea is that living in different places for members of the same family is a strategy to spread risks and diversify the sources of income. Basically, if you're a family living in a region with a lot of drought, you're going to send a member of the family, for instance, in a town where he's going to be able to generate incomes that he will share with the family in the origin place. And maybe you're going also to send, in Senegal there are a lot of social anthropological literature on that. You're going to send somebody else in another region, a rural region where they grow other crops, so that if this crop is affected by, I don't know what, a drought, those who are living there will not have the same risk, and they will be overall able to generate incomes for everybody. And so the idea is that it's the same thing for international migration. And at some point we had a discussion before on Mexican migrants who are in the US, and since the crisis they may experiment various economic difficulties, and the families here in Mexico can send money to them. So there is this idea that if you are in different places, then you are submitted to different risks, and you are able to generate different incomes, and then on average at the end you're going to be able to survive and generate more earnings.
Gracias. ¿Otras preguntas? No tienen toda. Bueno, yo tenía una pregunta sobre voy a traducir eso, sobre el impacto de género. Comentaste que cuando las relaciones de género son más desiguales, hay menos reunificación. Eso es lo que enseñan los datos cuando ya les relaciones.
Are you going to ask us in English?
Est-ce que c'est un résultat de l'enquête des données, mais qu'est-ce que comment ça est-ce que c'est des résultats qu'on a vus avec les hommes ou avec les femmes? Quels sont les résultats que, peut-être pas l'enquête, mais alors les entretiens que vous avez faits permettent de définir? C'est quelque chose de général, ou il y a quelqu'un un des sexes qui pousse vers là? Es la discusión sobre la diferenciación por género, que con mayor desigualdad, menos reunificación. Si eso se da por decisión de uno, entonces si hay mayor desigualdad quiere decir que la relación de poder son desiguales, entonces uno de ambos de los sexos deciden esto, o eso es un resultado que conviene a los dos sexos.
Okay, clearly this is something what we expected looking at the literature on gender relationships and migration. We expected this idea that more educated women would be more likely to reunify, and this is something that was shown with the Latin American project, like a brother at the MMP project, well, this is something we expected, with the idea that when women are more educated, there are probably more egalitarian relationships within the couple. And also with the idea that more educated people are more likely to choose each other and to be more independent, less enmeshed in the traditional family structure. But what we could not see, and it would take additional field work, is how the decision is taken. We have no information at all on the bargain within the couple. We see clearly that more educated women are more likely to reunify, especially in more patriarchal contexts like Senegal. But we do not have any information on how it works, how the decision is taken, how whether this is women pushing for reunification, maybe against the will of their husband, or but there is qualitative evidence, for instance, of in Senegal or in Mali of women who say clearly that they do not want to reunify, that they are not interested in living with their husband, and there are also some observations of qualitativists saying that especially in Senegal, young spouses who are left with their in-laws want to move because they are left with their in-laws, and life is not very easy to when you have to live with your husband's parents. So it's the qualitative evidence is mixed, and we haven't seen any field work on it, and I haven't seen any publication on how it works within the couples and how people decide within the couple. There is evidence, qualitative evidence, on the fact that the elders, especially in Senegal, are seriously against reunification, because if they have the wife and the children with them, first they have some help, and second they have the money because there are those who receive the remittances. And so it's a way to maintain their social and economic power.
Hey, Cris, thank you very much for your presentation. It was really, really interesting. Sorry if my partner here and I were discussing about that concept, but we don't get it completely right. What do you understand by reunification? We wonder if that conceptualization is not too westernized, because as you were mentioning before, maybe what we have is this idea to reunify under the idea that in the Western society is considered to be a family, when the social structure in those countries cannot be anything near to that.
So the question would be: reunification in our case is we have two partners. One is in a country of destination in Europe, and the other is left behind in Africa. And the one left behind is the woman, and the one in Europe is the man. Actually, would I like to have also the reverse situation, but it was only possible for Congolese migrants, because Congolese women are more often in the position, are more often pioneers, living behind their partner, than in Ghana or Senegal. So we didn't have a sufficient number of female migrants in Europe among Senegalese and Ghanaians to be able to do analysis on them. So this is why we had this restrictive view of the couple, with the migrants being the pioneer and the woman being left behind. This is less true in Congo, but doing the comparison forced us to look at this, men in Europe and females behind. And so reunification in this case is they declare they are together. At the interview, we declares that he has a partner. They are not living in the same country, and at some point they are living in the same country, and they are living in the same country, whatever the legal channel through which they live in the same country. So it can be regular migration, it can be irregular migration, it could be for studies, it could be for anything. And I don't know whether I properly answered to your question or whether you want to specify.
Well, what we were really interested is to know if at some point it was considered the structure that they may have, that it doesn't really correspond to that you are defining as reunification.
Well,
and that's really difficult to grasp at all.
Yeah.
So,
okay, so basically the idea is that your point is we are in a context where extended families are numerous, where the functioning of families is not like in Europe, etc. And we look only at nuclear families, only at couples, right? There are two answers. One is reunification in Europe is considered only for married partners and for children. So the concept of the policy concept of reunification forces you into this Western view of couples and of family. That's the policy justification. The other justification is that it's already complicated to have information, so rich retrospective information on the respondent and on the partner. And if you want to extend it to other members of the family, it becomes super complicated. So practically, I don't know whether how we would be able to have a larger view of family.
Bueno, podremos seguir discutiendo sobre justamente los conceptos de la familia, las familias transnacionales. Entonces, vamos a agradecer mucho la presentación de Cris Beauchemin, y nos dejó las referencias, son muchos artículos publicados ahí en revista que nos permiten conocer esa parte de la migración entre entonces, África y Europa y la vida de las familias. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much for your invitation.